Hello. Today I'm going to attempt to use a question the author strategy as part of a lesson on the Great Depression. We're going to be reviewing an article that ties into various themes that we've previously discussed. Now, to utilize question the author, I had to first analyze the article for major points and also understanding pitfalls that students may have. Then I had to break the article into various sections or segments, and then develop questions that relate to each of those segments. So with that in mind, let's get started. I would introduce my class and say good morning. As we discussed yesterday in our introduction to the Great Depression, I gave you 6 causes that led to the Great Depression. Does anyone remember what those causes were? Correct. They were the Treaty of Versailles itself, the Roaring Twenties, the agriculture system collapse, the Hawley-Smoot Tariff Act, the stock market collapse, and the banking system collapse. Now, in the banking system collapse, we said that it had to do with the Federal Reserve deciding not to pump money into the banks, and the money stock contracted. Now, today we're going to delve further into that subject of the banking system collapse, and to do that, we're going to utilize this article. Now, who can tell me what they think this article might be about just based on the title? As you can see, it says From the Cross of Gold to Central Banking. 3 key episodes in American financial history. So obviously it's probably talking about 3 things. The first being maybe the cross of gold, and the last being central banking. That would be a good guess. Today, we're only going to talk about the last one, central banking. This article does talk about 3 things. The first one was in the 1890s, then the bank run in 1907, and then finally the central banking issue related to the Great Depression. And that's all that we're going to talk about today. Is this article, this third part, which is the Fed's first big challenge, the recession of 1929. On paper, the Fed had the ability to limit financial panics and keep any future downturn from becoming a depression. In practice, monetary policy was challenging to implement. What does the author mean by that? On paper versus in practice. Any idea, Eric? Yes, just because you write something doesn't mean you can actually do it. It's like me writing down that I can how to throw a pass 50 yards. It doesn't mean I can throw a football 50 yards. So, okay, moving on. The Fed faced its first big challenge in 1929 with a downturn that did not seem severe at first. Is the author saying that the stock market crash wasn't a big deal? Juan? Any ideas? Well, yes, of course. It seemed like it wasn't anything to worry about at first. The trouble started with housing and automobiles, 2 industries whose expansion had led the growth of the 1920s. By the end of the 1920s, the people most likely to buy homes and cars had already bought them. When purchases of homes and cars slowed down, the stage was set for a mild recession in 1929. This perfectly ties into our Roaring Twenties cause. That things were going great, we bought a lot of stuff, well then everybody bought everything. Next, with sales of housing and cars falling, unemployment in those industries soon followed. The reduced spending from laid-off workers spread the damage beyond the housing and automotive industries. LaShawn, do you know, what does the author mean by this? Right, well said. If people were being laid off, they didn't have money to buy stuff in other areas, so then that area slowed down too. Correct, very well said. For separate reasons, agriculture had bad years in the late 1920s. Does the author explain this clearly, Jamal? Not really. He just kind of says that agriculture was bad. Okay, well, we'll see. We'll move on. Even so, nothing unusual had happened yet. The pattern of economic activity from 1929 through 1931 looked like one of the temporary pauses often experienced in the long upward march of prosperity. Huh. Well, now it looks like the author is saying the stock market crash was a normal thing. Does that sound right, Shelby? Yes. And maybe we'll figure out some more of this later. What he means by that? Let's see what he says next. The Depression followed soon after the stock market crash of 1929, but that sequence of events does not mean that the crash caused the Great Depression. Economists still study the Great Depression today, we said that yesterday, because they disagree about what caused it. Global and U.S. experience show that it is possible to have a stock market crash without a depression. The U.S. economy had a stock market crashes in 73 and 74, in 2000 through 2002 that led only to mild depressions. It had a major stock market crash in 1987 with no recession at all. Well, it does sound like stock market crashes are normal. So does that connect with what the author previously stated there, Sharita? Yes, that it does say that stock market crashes, they continue to happen. A stock market crash is bad for an economy, to be sure. It causes people to be less wealthy and reduces their income from stocks they own. The 1929 stock market crash sparked doubts about the health of the economy, that led consumers and businesses to pull back on spending. The crash also destroyed considerable wealth, but the crash alone did not cause the Great Depression. And it looks like right now, so the author is aligned with our introduction from yesterday, that it wasn't just the crash. One well-tested explanation of the Great Depression focuses on the collapse of the U.S. banking system and the resulting contraction of the nation's money supply or money stock. Okay, does the author explain contraction well enough for everyone? Do you understand what he means by that? Okay, good. Monetary historians Milton Friedman and Anna Schwartz called this specific reduction in money supply the Great Contraction. Roll ahead here. They showed how the Great Contraction turned a mild recession in 1929 into the Great Depression of the 1930s. Friedman and Schwartz made a strong case that the falling money stock caused a sharp decline in output and prices in the economy. Spending on goods and services declined, which caused firms to cut prices and output and to lay workers off. Faced with declining incomes, borrowers had difficulty repaying loans, defaults and bankruptcies soared, creating a vicious spiral in which more banks failed and the money stock contracted further, leading to a continued decline in output, prices, and employment. Does the author make sense here? Krista, do you understand what they're trying to say? Yes, that it was a vicious cycle, that it just, as things kept happening, it just kept going down, like down the drain. Friedman and Schwartz showed that the real culprit behind the Great Depression was the failure of the Federal Reserve to act as the lender of last resort. Wait, I thought the author said economists still don't agree. Jaquita? Does that make sense? Right. Maybe there's what they're saying is, of the list of things that caused it, this is at the top of the list. Okay. At least in this author's eyes. Right. The Federal Reserve had the ability to make loans from its reserves to troubled member banks. Member banks. Although by law the Federal Reserve could not lend directly to banks that did not belong to the Federal Reserve System, it could have purchased securities in the open market, and the money it paid for these securities would have flooded the banking system with reserves. Okay, everyone, I know we're getting into deep financial waters here, economic stuff. So does this make sense? We good? Okay. However, the Federal Reserve hesitated. Waves of bank failures struck the economy between 1930 and 1933. More than 9,000 banks failed. The failures were caused in large measure by misguided monetary policy, specifically the Federal Reserve allowing the money stock to collapse as panics engulfed the banking system. It is difficult to overstate how shocking widespread bank runs followed by bank failures can be. This last thing, what does the author mean by this? Have you all heard of the stories from the Great Depression of people committing suicide when they lost everything, their businesses and all their money and everything, and just to see the absolute panic of people on the streets as they're rushing in to try to get what money they can, even though it turns out there wasn't any. And he's just saying, I guess he's trying to say, I really can't describe it. So, the Federal Reserve's reasons for letting banks fail seemed plausible at the time. The Fed could not by law directly lend to banks that did not belong to the Federal Reserve System. Some of the failing banks were badly managed. Letting them fail would rid the banking system of its weaker elements, ideally making the remaining banks stronger. Yet any advantage of strengthening remaining banks was crushed in the banking panics. Did the author explain this clearly for everyone? Right, it's the idea of, if you heard the statement, we've heard the statements before, too big to fail. Well, back then, it looks like they had the idea that, no, we'll let some of these fail. The problem was, it spiraled out of control. Banking systems rely on the confidence of depositors that they will be able to access the money they have in banks whenever they want to. If that confidence is shaken, as it was during the Great Depression, there are runs on banks that lead to panics. During the Great Depression, many banks could not or would not borrow from the Federal Reserve because they either lacked acceptable collateral or did not belong to the Federal Reserve system. As depositors pulled their money out of banks, banks lost reserves and had to contract their loans and deposits, which reduced the money supply, money stock. The monetary contraction, along with the chaos caused by the failure of large numbers of banks, caused the economy to collapse. Now, how does this relate to what the author has already said, Jace? Yes, I would agree with that, Jace. Over here where he talks about how the Federal Reserve hesitated, which caused the wave of bank failures. I would go with that. We now know that misguided monetary policy played a major part in allowing what started as a mild recession to become the Great Depression. Conventionally written history makes the Great Depression seem inevitable. What does the author mean by that? Yes, Chris. Hindsight's 20/20. Everybody loves to pick apart things after it's already happened and go, oh, we knew this was going to happen. Yes, that's exactly what he's saying. But the length and scope of the downturn would have been far less severe if policymakers had chosen differently. The United States came to the eve of World War II with a central bank that was quite modern in its structure, but also with experience that showed regulating an economy through its banking system and money supply was no easy matter. Does this last statement allude to something the author's already said, Antoine? Well, right. He said a little while ago that we've had several stock market crashes. So he said it's no easy matter. They're right. It keeps happening. So, that's a good point. Hopefully this example has been helpful in showing how Question the Author can be utilized in reviewing an article in relation to a lesson for class. Thank you.